Welcome to the Case Lore Podcast. It's the true crime podcast that's wordier. In this podcast, I look at true crime cases from both a legal and historical perspective. So if you want a fresh take on bad things happening to other people, you're in the right place. In this episode, I'm going to examine the second appeal case of one of the last two capital punishment executions carried out in Canada, Lucas v. Regina, 1962. There is a PDF appendix to this episode, which I'll include in the show notes, so that you can check out my citations and sources, as well as some photographs that I found to be of interest. I'm a non-practicing but licensed paralegal in Ontario, a legal researcher and a trainer. And one of the things that I find fascinating about reading legal cases is the narrative of one of the most important things happening in this person's life at that time. I think we can get great insight into how our society was at the time of a court case, and we can look at the way the decisions were written and see the values and biases of the time and how the crime affected the emotions of the public. It's almost like legal anthropology. I'm also interested in looking at how legal theories are applied to these cases and what they can tell us about the legal system and the people in it at that time. Legal matters are snapshots in time, and I'd like to take a closer look at not only what's in the frame, but what's on the outside of it. Now, when I analyze a case, I'm looking at evidence, not guilt. The accused may very well be guilty, but our legal system is built on the idea that we are happy to let 99 guilty people go so that one innocent person isn't convicted. It's such a high standard because someone's life and freedom is on the line. Unfortunately, sometimes passions can take hold, and despite our best efforts, the system can only work as designed when human biases are put into check. Please keep this philosophy in mind when you listen. I'm not defending people that have done wrong things, but I do want to make sure that we are treating them fairly. 710 people were hung in Canada between 1859 and 1962, and uncountable people were hung in pre-Confederation Canada. There were 230 different hanging offenses, including being disguised in the woods and stealing turnips. Now, in 1859, they codified murder, rape, and treason as the three capital offenses going forward. And yes, you did hear that correctly. When we had the death penalty, the only Canadian-approved way to execute criminals was by hanging, unless they had done wrong in the military, and then they would face a firing squad. The sentences of Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin were carried out at 2 minutes after midnight on December 11th, 1962. I'm only going to be talking about Lucas in this episode. There are doubts to his guilt, and from reviewing the court case, I'm not sure that the evidence meets the burden of proof to convict him of a crime with such a steep punishment, even if he was guilty. But first, let's meet the people involved. The accused is Arthur Lucas, who was born August 16, 1910 in Daytona Beach, Florida. I couldn't find out what his early life was like, although newspaper articles mentioned that he didn't have a great childhood. I don't know when he left Florida exactly, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Great Migration of 1920, when many people of color left the South in order to start a new life in Detroit, a source of better job opportunities and freedom from Jim Crow laws. He was captured on paper in the 1930 census as living in a Michigan state prison, and again in 1940 as being in a federal institution. Lucas's draft card lists his sister, Lizzie, as his contact who would always know his address. What is known is that in Detroit, Lucas made his way in life as a gambler and a pimp. He lived in a 7-room duplex at 5132 Burns Avenue in Detroit with his girlfriend Lily Boykin and an alcoholic named Wesley Knox. Lizzie would come to visit on weekends. Lucas was separated from his wife, but he often visited her at her apartment at 1720 Collingwood Avenue. A drug addict and dealer named Morris Thomas occasionally crashed at the house. The victims are Therlin Crater and Carolyn Newman. Therlin Crater was born November 11, 1917 in Altimer, Arkansas. According to census records, at some point in the 30s, his family had moved to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, before ending up in St. Louis City, Missouri in 1940. At the same time that Lucas was in prison, Crater was living with his brother and his brother's family working as a laborer. Therlin's draft card also lists his sister as the person that would always know his address, Ruth Wright. Crater was married at this time to a woman named Mary. It was sometime probably around this year that Carolyn Newman was born. Carolyn, as the court records her, was around 20 or 21 at the time of her murder. Trying to track down correct information about this woman that was murdered has proved incredibly challenging for me, and more so than you might think it would be. Her age and the spelling of her name varies from article to article. I'm going to refer to her as Carolyn for consistency with the court decision, but newspaper articles report her as going by Jean Rochelle, Jean Carter, and Carol Ann instead of Carolyn. They also report her as being anywhere from ages 20 to 28, depending on the article, and the court case she's recorded as being 23. I couldn't find a census record, a grave, or even an obituary for her under any of those names. I have no idea where she's buried. The details of her life are lost to the fog of history for me, and I really wish I could have learned more about her. I did write to the Toronto Coroner's Office and Archives Ontario, but neither has records of her. I do have a suspicion that there is a possibility she wasn't correctly identified. I don't have access to the coroner's report or to know if her family picked up her body even. It's very possible that if she wasn't claimed, she was buried in a potter's field. What is known is that she was a sex worker, and this is always pointed out by newspaper articles and the court as well. She was killed by having her throat cut brutally. Therlin suffered the same fate, but was additionally shot. What is known is that Crater and Newman had moved to Toronto shortly after Crater was involved in a narcotics operation as an informant to gather evidence on Gus Saunders. Saunders and his wife Eloise were trafficking heroin from Chicago into Detroit. The Saunders knew Crater, Newman, and Lucas, so the motive pushed by the Crown was that Saunders had hired Lucas to go and kill Crater before he could testify in court. In fact, in the case United States v. Saunders, there is a footnote that says, "It appears in the record that the informer, Therlin Crater, was murdered prior to the trial of this case under circumstances which led the trial court to comment, 'I further find the murder of the government's chief witness in the prosecution.'" In March of 1961, Saunders learned that Crater was cooperating with the authorities. Later that spring to early summer, Crater and Newman moved to Toronto. The pair were arrested on November 14, 1961 for keeping a common bawdy house. They were released on bail in the evening on November 16, 1961. This is the day that things really start to get into motion. Lucas borrowed Saunders' car and left Detroit for the 4-hour drive to Toronto. And just a note for younger listeners, back before the 80s, it was pretty common for people to borrow cars for long trips for a number of reasons. Maybe your buddy's car had air conditioning or was in better shape mechanically than yours and you knew it could actually make the trip. But I just wanted to put into context that borrowing someone's car for a road trip in 1961 was not out of the ordinary. Additionally, the two men had a history of lending each other their cars. In any case, Lucas arrived at the border and the customs official noted that there was 2 people in the car. He arrived at the Waverly Hotel and struck up a conversation with a hotel bar patron named Willie White. Lucas said he didn't have enough money to rent a room, so he asked Willie White to split a double occupancy room with him. White agreed, and Lucas checked in around 4 p.m. using his real name. That evening, Crater and Newman were released on bail and returned to their residence at 116 Kendall Avenue in Toronto. The house was divided up into 3 apartments, and they were living on the 2nd floor, with the front room on the main floor as well. Their neighbors were a postal worker named McGuire, who lived on the main floor, and a married couple, the Kings, who lived in the basement. Crater spoke to Lucas on the phone after they returned home from the police station. As evening turned into early morning, Lucas came over to visit Crater and Newman around 3 a.m. on November 17th. The apartment was about a 5-minute drive from the Waverly Hotel. Lucas freely admitted to knowing and visiting Crater and Newman the day before they were murdered. He had come to Toronto to discuss going into business with them by setting up a bawdy house. Lucas said that they drank whiskey and talked about the prostitution business, and even discussed Lucas renting one of the rooms in the apartment to stay. Lucas called home to Detroit around 4:35 a.m., and then he returned to his hotel around 6 a.m. and checked out. Lucas arranged with the hotel clerk that Willie White could stay in the room until checkout time, and the whereabouts of White was never investigated, and he was never seen by Lucas after initially going into the room the night before. The police never talked to Willie White either. Lucas went to a Chinese cafe to get breakfast on Dundas Street and then headed back to Detroit. The American border guard reported only one person returning back to the United States. He arrived at his estranged wife's apartment at 6 p.m., spoke to his friend Wesley Knox, who tipped Lucas off that the police were looking for him. When Lucas returned to his apartment later, he was arrested. The United States allowed a very quick extradition of Lucas. There is barely any coverage regarding this in the Detroit newspapers that I found at the time. After Lucas claimed to have left, all hell broke loose on Kendall Avenue. At 6:20 a.m., the Kings were awoken by the sound of a scuffle upstairs. They heard 3 gunshots and a woman scream. At 6:30 a.m., the house was silent. An emergency phone call was placed around this time and was answered by an operator named Elizabeth Williams. She heard struggling and screams. Williams tried to call back but got no answer, so she put through the request to the police for the call to be traced. The police operator, Jemima McCabe, said that she had received an emergency call at 6:33 a.m. and heard a scuffle in the background and a woman's voice saying, "Oh, my throat," or "not my throat." The police were unfortunately given the wrong address, Kendall Drive instead of Kendall Avenue. This wasn't corrected until the landlord phoned the police to report the murder around 7:04 a.m. The bodies were found at 7 a.m. when McGuire returned home from his work at the postal office. Crater was found at the front door in his underwear. He had been shot 4 times by a .38 caliber firearm, and his throat had been cut. Newman was in the bedroom, nude and in a pool of blood. She also suffered slash wounds to her throat. There was a ring found next to her. 6 months later, on April 30th, 1962, Lucas's trial began. It would last 10 days. All of the physical evidence brought against Lucas was circumstantial. There was blood found in the car, at Lucas's apartment, and under his fingernails. Now, the blood was mostly type B, the same as both the victims, but there was also some AB found in the car. Lucas had a cut on his hand and had cut his fingernails recently and had a gunpowder fragment embedded in his hand. A ring belonging to Lucas had been found at the scene. A .38 caliber handgun with the serial number filed off was found on the Burlington Skyway Bridge the day after the murder. So let's look at these pieces of evidence. At the time, there was no DNA evidence, but labs could identify if blood was animal or human and what type it was. Of all of the evidence given, Lucas's blood type was never revealed to the courtroom. Also, the assumption is being made that the blood was put there recently. Yes, it was a new car, but the owner and the original driver of the car is Gus Saunders, the drug kingpin of Detroit. Lucas could have cut his hand at any time, and not necessarily because he carried out the murder. His blood was never identified, so trying to tie him to the scene is a bit of a stretch. Keeping one's fingernails trimmed is just good hygiene. The gunpowder fragment embedded in his hand could have similarly happened at any time. There is no way to prove that the powder came from the murder weapon on that night. He did, after all, by his own admission, lead a life of violence. Lucas never denied owning the ring found at the scene. He needed some cash, as proof of him not being able to actually have his own hotel room. So he gave it to Crater in pawn for $15. Now, there was some discussion in the appeal case about how Crater could have had cash on him to loan Lucas $15, but what I believe was overlooked was that Crater and Newman had just been bailed out, so they likely had some cash on hand that they had borrowed. This is strictly anecdotal, but I'd like you to consider how close-knit communities in poverty are. If someone needs to borrow something and you have it, you lend it. That way, when you need help, someone will pay you back the favor. I also have a hard time believing that a ring would just fall off, not be noticed, and left at the scene of a crime. The gun was identified by Knox as being like one owned by Lucas, and it was positively identified by Thomas as being the one Lucas owned. However, Lucas said it wasn't his, and if he was going to ditch a murder weapon, he would have actually made sure it went into the river. Additionally, for reasons that I'm going to discuss in a moment, Thomas isn't a very reliable witness. I also think we need to look at how common .38s were at this particular time. .38s were the choice gun of police and military, and I realize that this gun was probably not obtained in a lawful manner, but we have to look at .38s were very common and very prolific, which means finding one on the street is going to be even easier. This was very much not a unique style of gun. There was some testimony given by Lucas's neighbor, Morris Thomas. Now, Thomas testified that Lucas was a narcotics dealer, that the gun that the police found on the Skyway was the same gun owned by Lucas, that Lucas had asked Knox to bring him a fresh set of clothes from his apartment over to his ex-wife's on the evening of November 17th. Thomas had come by, and Lucas was only in his underwear and said that his suit and his shoes were wet. Now, Lucas freely admitted to being a pimp. However, he denied selling narcotics or being a murderer. And one might think that this is a strange hill to die on, but those that make their living on the edges of society still have standards of behavior. For example, just because someone is a thief, that doesn't make them a killer. Lucas worked for Saunders, yes, but likely only for certain kinds of jobs. Organized crime means that people are specialists, not generalists. I'm not sure if Thomas talked to the police for attention, because he didn't like Lucas, or because he was being threatened. However, it's awfully convenient that he was able to identify the gun as positively belonging to Lucas, and able to give information about the change of clothes. I am extremely sympathetic to those with addictions. It is not a life that anyone would choose. However, when Thomas was questioned about his dealings with Lucas, he proved his unreliability as a witness by perjuring himself on the stand. Thomas claimed in a very detailed story that he and Lucas had made a trip to Chicago to pick up narcotics and to bring them back to Detroit. Thomas said that Lucas had distributed narcotics and that Thomas worked for him. At the preliminary inquiry, Thomas denied taking the trip with Lucas to Chicago because he didn't want to be implicated. So bearing this in mind, he's not the most reliable witness. There's also 2 missing guys. Willie White was never found, and the other occupant of the car that came into Canada but didn't go back to the United States was never identified. Lucas was found guilty of the murder of Theron Crater in the first degree. No one was ever convicted of the murder of Carolyn Newman, and the first appeal on September 26, 1962 was rejected. Lucas's second and last appeal, the case that I'm discussing now, was on November 30th, 1962, just over a year after the murders took place. His appeal was based on 3 points: error in opening address of the Crown Counsel, the admission of evidence which pointed to the bad character of the accused and his connection and association with other persons of bad character, unfair prejudice to the accused as a result of the cross-examination which dealt with his activities as a manager of prostitutes and his alleged connection with trafficking in narcotics and his associations with other persons engaged in the same business. In his opening, the Crown Counsel said, quote, "The search of 5132 Burns produced a pair of men's shoes which were positive for blood, 2 handkerchiefs, a shirt, and a sheet, all of which bore blood stains. When he got to Detroit, he went perhaps to his own apartment at 5132 Burns Avenue and changed his shoes. His underwear, which was found in the basement, had been washed but still was blood-stained." Unquote. In closing, he also said, "When I started at the outset, I outlined that I intended to call evidence of which I expected to be proved, and I think I can say now that that has been done." The problem is that none of the items that were referred to as being found at 5132 Burns Avenue were produced as exhibits. This is very problematic for the jury, as they may consider that additional evidence when making their decision. However, it was never brought to court, so they should never have been told about it. The majority of judges, Kerwin, Taschereau, Foto, Martland, Judson, and Ritchie, decided that the trial judge and the Crown had given enough preambles and warnings about the evidence being mentioned but not entered, and were not swayed by the defense's argument at all. Further, I'd like to point out that Burns Avenue was a hub of socialization and coming and going. Lucas was not the only man living there. Additionally, his girlfriend Lily was also a sex worker. Now, I bear no stigmatization to her trade at all, and we can have that discussion another day, but I don't think that we can discount the activity of many different people visiting and possibly leaving objects at this location. Therefore, I don't think that we can say with any certainty that all of the blood on the shoes, handkerchiefs, shirt, and sheet were put there by Lucas, nor that the blood belonged to the victims. The blood may have come from another source. According to the American Red Cross, B-positive blood can be found in approximately 18% of African Americans, 9% of whites and Latinx populations, and 25% of Asian Americans. B-negative belongs to a much smaller percentage of the population, 2% of whites, 1% of African American and Latinx, and finally 0.04% of Asian people. However, we're not told in the appeal decision if the blood was Rh positive or negative. The majority decision was that the appeal should be dismissed and that the trial judge's instructions to the jury to disregard the evidence that wasn't entered and the unreliability of Thomas was sufficient. The judges did also not see the merit in Lucas's assertion that the casting of his character in a negative light affected the jury prejudicially. Quote, "The next point dealt with by the Court of Appeal was the evidence pointing to the bad character of Lucas and his associations with other persons of bad character. There was much of this kind of evidence. Indeed, it was difficult for any witness to give any evidence about the activities of Lucas without bringing these matters out. Lucas himself relied on this mode of life as a part of his defense. He denied the commission of the crime, and he asserted that he was indifferent to the fate of Saunders and the relation between Saunders and Carter. His own evidence in chief was intended to show that he had lived a life dependent upon prostitution and to a certain extent upon gambling, but not trafficking in drugs." Unquote. Lucas denied that he had sold narcotics or was a murderer. He owned being a pimp and the certain amount of violence that came with that life. However, as I mentioned before, it's not uncommon for there to be standards among those in the criminal lifestyle. For example, the origin Italian-American mafia had a reputation for being very anti-drug, whether this is true or not. Sure, you may use violence and intimidation to do business, but you don't actually want to kill anyone. Even among those that sell drugs, there are dealers that won't traffic in narcotics because of the higher stakes that come with drugs of that potency. Someone that sells cannabis only is not involved with the same risks as someone that deals in opioids, for example. Of course, you can always be robbed, but the threats to you from your customers are vastly different when you're selling something that is so addictive and is the source of incredible desperation. And this is perhaps more nuanced than the all-white male jury of the 1960s could have considered. One judge dissented, Cartwright. He didn't believe that Thomas was a credible witness, and much of the case relied upon his testimony. He wrote that he had trouble reconciling the evidence being mentioned with the majority judge's affirmation that the, quote, omission was of little or no consequence and could not reasonably be found that it influenced the jury against the accused, unquote. He thought the majority of the evidence was circumstantial and was not compelled by the blood evidence, especially because Lucas's blood type was never established. Further, Cartwright doubted that Lucas would go to a hotel and check in under his own name, make phone calls to his own apartment from the victim's home, writing, quote, a murderer could scarcely be expected to sign a guest book in the victim's house, unquote. Cartwright concluded his dissension with the following passage. The case made by the prosecution is a very strong one. I do not suggest that if the conduct of the trial had been free from errors which, in my opinion, were made by the jury acting honestly and reasonably, might not have convicted the accused. Indeed, that they would have very well may seem probable. But that is not enough. I find myself unable to affirm that they must necessarily have done so. It follows then that I should allow the appeal. I regret having written at such length, but I have the misfortune to differ not only from the unanimous judgment of the Court of Appeal, but also from the conclusion arrived by the other members of the Court. It seems proper that I should set out with some particularity the reasons that compel me to this result. I would allow the appeal, quash the conviction, and direct a new trial." Unquote. So with the appeal dismissed, Lucas was out of options save for clemency. And despite an emergency meeting of the Canadian government on December 4th, 1961, no mercy would come for Lucas. Despite an emergency meeting of the Canadian government on December 4th, 1961, no mercy would come for Lucas and his gallows mate Turpin. Both men had speedy trials and were defended separately by a bright and passionate but new lawyer named Ross McKay. The double hanging was carried out on Tuesday, December 11th, 1962, at 2 minutes after midnight. Lucas maintained his innocence until the end. When the executioner, alias Jack Ellis, dropped the weight to pull the condemned off their feet, it tore Lucas's head off. Ellis had hanged 15 men since 1953 and was paid a total of $1,000 by the York County Sheriff's Office. The death penalty was abolished July 26, 1976. Today the gallows at Don Jail are gone, as are the cells of Lucas and Turpin, replaced by a washroom and a kitchenette. Lucas and Turpin are buried in Prospect Cemetery, sections 13 and 14 respectively, lot 415. I don't know where Thurland, Crater, or Carolyn Newman are buried, but I hope their families found peace. Thank you for listening to the Case Lore Podcast. You can find us on socials at Case Lore Podcast, and our email is caselorepodcast@gmail.com. Our theme song is an 8-bit cover that I created of the Night Court theme, originally composed by Jack Elliott. Until next time, keep an open mind.